Good morning, everyone. I'd like to convene the subcommittee meeting of Moore Municipal Tax Authority subcommittee meeting for Tuesday, April 2nd, 2013. Just a note for committee members and individuals in the room, the exits are clearly marked. If individuals in the room could also have their cell phones on vibrate or turn them down so as not to disturb the process before us here. Item 2 on the agenda is approval of minutes from the March 26th, 2013 meeting. Do I have a motion for approval? It's been moved by seconded by Representative Vargas. All those in favor of the minutes signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it. The minutes are approved. Under item 3 on the agenda, it was my thought prior to having our guest speakers have a presentation, to have a discussion amongst committee members on some different ideas that they may have thought about or in review of the minutes of the last meeting, ideas that may have cropped up for them for our review. And before I get to that, though, I just have to ask the administrators. We had a mission statement also, I believe, right? And okay, so that's been passed out. And before I get into that, does everybody had the opportunity to look over this subcommittee mission statement? If they haven't, if they could, for a moment, kind of look that over. That's being distributed now around the room. And I believe that it addresses recommendations both in the short term and long term that this committee will be able to put forward as recommendations to the larger committee of a whole. It's our desire that in achieving this mission statement that we have legislation to move forward both in the short term and long term by the third, beginning or middle of the fourth week of April. How does that look for everybody? Yes, I'd like to reconvene Municipal Tax Authority subcommittee meeting for more and move on to item 5 on our agenda. And our first presenters under Part 1 are land value taxation. And we have those two gentlemen right here. And we are being televised, gentlemen. If you could identify yourselves, and also if you could push the button, the light will go on, and that will be picked up by CTN and also by for committee members. So thank you very much for coming to the committee today. Please proceed.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chairman Berger. I'm Joshua Vincent. I'm the CEO of the Center for the Study of Economics. We're based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. We've been a nonprofit since 1926, working with mostly municipalities and state governments all across the country and overseas. And we're here today to talk about property taxes, and most especially real property taxes, and with an idea that we think and has already been discussed in the past several months as an idea that might assist Connecticut municipalities, especially ones with a great disparity in their mill rates compared to other towns and our economic competition with them. And I'm sharing the dais with our Connecticut director, Mark Spears, and Mark is a citizen of Bristol, Connecticut, and he's been doing lots of tax incidence research as it happens amongst the various municipalities in Connecticut. And essentially, Most of you have probably heard of the land value tax. I know that I've had meetings with the Hartford delegation and Hartford Council and Representative Wright during the New London land value tax effort. And the land value tax, quite simply, is not a new tax. It's a reframing and a reshaping of the current property tax. It's generally brought in a revenue-neutral manner, and it reframes the property tax by simply shifting the property tax rates down on buildings and moves a percentage of that millage rate to land value. And therefore, land value tax uses the current system of assessments and tax administration, and so it doesn't entail a need for additional layers of government. Now, I'm coming to you from Pennsylvania, which is like Connecticut as far as its cities go, but it's about 30 years ahead of the game. The steel industry collapsed in the late 1970s. Grand lists, or tax bases, as we would call them down in Pennsylvania, collapsed as well, and property taxes became pretty much unsustainable for the greater part of any community. And in the case of Pennsylvania, out-of-work steel workers or retired steel workers. So Pennsylvania has taken the lead in this, and it's used from towns as small as 2,500, Ebensburg, Pennsylvania, all the way up to the cities the size of Scranton, Allentown, and Pittsburgh. Currently, it's being discussed because of a revaluation in the city of Philadelphia. And what has the land value tax done in Pennsylvania? And it's been compared, the experience by such writers as Tom Condon in the Courant, to Hartford in particular. It's lowered taxes for productive homeowners, businesses, and people that use land to the greatest extent that it could be profitably. It's helped grow. Whoops. Okay. It's helped grow urban areas, and it's helped stabilize tax revenues. And we think that's very important. I'm going to give just a few simple illustrations of the effect of a land value tax. Now, this is Harrisburg, and you see in 1982 a series of 2-, 3-, 4-story mercantile buildings falling apart, and you see a lot of vacant lots. And it was, after East St. Louis, probably one of the most distressed cities in the United States, financially speaking, in 1982. It's a state capital, like Hartford, so half of the value is off the tax rolls. It's got lots of nonprofit organizations, lots of colleges, and again, they don't have as much contribution from these nonprofit entities. So Harrisburg has to get all the land that is taxable used. And that is a confluence of what's happening currently in Harrisburg. Now, Harrisburg implemented the land value tax gradually over a period of years. And this is, I promise, one of the very few charts, etc., and numbers. So it won't be too tough. But you can see that we compared two analog cities, Albany, New York, again, which is a city losing population, losing tax base, and half of it is tax exempt because it's a state capital, and compare Harrisburg. And we compared residential building permits on a per capita basis. And in 2003, when Harrisburg expanded its land value tax significantly, the trend and the actual numbers of residential building permits increased dramatically, even in the face of the other problems that Harrisburg has. And the reason is really quite simple. They tax land at 6 times the rate of buildings. It brings in the same amount of revenue. City services don't suffer in any way. But the emphasis of tax goes off of that important investment of labor and capital. Various smaller cities, which are, again, there's a lot of them in Connecticut that are the same, are places that are post-industrial and are trying to find a way forward, a way through the future so that they can pay for essential city services but still attract development, people, and growth in a way that doesn't break the bank, unlike, say, a tax abatement program or a TIF, which is temporary and can blow a hole in the budget of a municipality. And the center has worked with all of these cities over the years. Now, the most classic example of a land value tax and how does it work and what do you get is the example of Pittsburgh, which expanded its land value tax to a point where land was taxed at 8 times the rate of building values, and it was done during the collapse of the steel industry in the late 70s and early 80s. And this is a visualization that we did of a study by Oates and Schwab, 2 prominent urban economists from the University of Maryland. They did this in conjunction with the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, who I'm sure you're familiar with. Except for Columbus, Ohio, during that period, every Rust Belt city saw a decline in building permit issuance. People stopped investing in the cities themselves, except for Pittsburgh. And when it was filtered and when the analysis took place, the economists concluded that the fact that revenue came from land, meaning then that the city could exempt buildings from taxation, that exemption led to, naturally, more buildings. And it was a pretty rigorous study. Now, I'm going to pass it over to Mark in a minute, but I just wanted to let you know that Connecticut can do the same thing. The grand lists of every Connecticut town, this happens to be Hartford's grand list, have the assessments split into land and building values. Assessments are very good, and I'm glad to know that the assessors are following us so I can pat them on the back. Assessments, as a rule, are very good in the state of Connecticut. In Pennsylvania, you can go 40 or 50 years without a reassessment. The difference with LVT is that the higher rate is placed on land as opposed to the building. So a vacant lot, a flat top surface parking lot, such as we see all over Hartford, things of that nature could expect to pay more, and they ought to. They're enjoying city services. They're enjoying the infrastructure that productive taxpayers pay for and build, and they're not paying their fair share. As I heard Representative Vargas say before we got going, you can sit on a very valuable tract of vacant land in downtown Hartford and pay nothing for decade upon decade. You can wait until kingdom come before you get your price. Meanwhile, dollar-wise, that's some of the most valuable land in the city. I should say that we also, in advance of the occasion today, wrote a book. Don't feel like you have to read it all, but we hope that'll be a manual for the Commission to look at the land value tax more in depth, and it just discusses the legislation, the history, where it's been used elsewhere, and its possible application. And so I am going to pass it over to Mark Spears, Bristol, Connecticut.
Hi, I'm Mark Spears. I'm the Regional Director for the Center for the Study of Economics, and as Josh said, I live in Bristol, Connecticut. And what I'm going to talk about is how a land value tax would affect a single parcel. We found that sometimes the easiest way to get a good handle on land value tax is just pretty much step through what would happen with a parcel with a standard tax versus a land value tax. So up on the screen here, what we have is a picture of an empty lot. This is in New London. And this lot is not on here, but this lot has an assessed value of $64,000. Okay, and if you can see on the left, there's a scale. That's the tax bill. That's the scale for the tax bill for this lot. And at $64,000, what they pay right now for taxes is $1,135 a year on that lot. That's for the year. So that's about $98 a month. Whoever owns that lot's paying about $98 a month to hold on to that. As you probably know, I mean, $98 really isn't a really good incentive for anybody to do anything if they wanted to sit on that for like 5, 10, 15 years, they would be more than financially able to do that, I'm sure. So what we wanted to see is what would happen if we instituted a land value tax on this lot. What would happen to the taxes here? Okay, and as you can see at the bottom, what we have, the traditional tax rate, which we have now, is 25.3 mils. And we're going to use a pure, just for make it easier to understand, less math, we're going to use a straight land value tax. In other words, we're going to put all the tax on the land and 0 on buildings. And the number we're going to use is 65 mil tax rate. So with a 25.3 mil standard tax rate and a 65 mil tax rate just on land, what would happen to the taxes on this empty lot? Okay. So you can see right off the bat, taxes go up to $2,917 on this lot. Right away, that's less of an incentive, or more of an incentive for the person owning this lot not to sit on it or do anything constructive with it that would benefit the neighborhood and the community. All right, so we'll assume that that's what he says. He says the same thing. Okay, that's too much taxes. I want to either build, or he sells if somebody wants to build. Okay, and we'll say we put a building on that lot. Okay, so I'm going to add another scale for building value, and we'll say that the builder wants to put a $300,000 building on that lot. What will happen to the taxes now between a standard tax and a land value tax with that $300,000 building? Okay, with the traditional, because it's a straight land value tax and there is no tax on the buildings, the tax stays the same with that $300,000 building on it. However, with that $300,000 building on it with the standard property taxes, the tax will go up to $6,448. Okay? And if we connect the dots, you get a graph that looks like this. Now this is, if you understand this graph, you kind of understand the basic of how a land value tax works. Basically, this graph is in 2 halves, the left half and the right half. The left half is basically, that's the rise in the holding costs, which gives the landowner an incentive to build or sell. Okay. The right side, on the other hand, the decrease in the tax bill is going to allow the builder or developer to capitalize those savings, which either allows for higher profit per unit or ability to sell more units. And it's also, you can see how sometimes it's called the carrot and the stick approach. The left side is the stick, the right side is the carrot. And it's also shows a little bit of how land value tax stays revenue neutral. Basically, you're giving people a tax break on their buildings by adding taxes to what would be considered less productive, where you don't, it's not going to bother the extra taxes, and that's on the land section. Okay. And okay, here's just some pictures of some properties in Pennsylvania where the land value tax is instituted. Harrisburg and Allentown, some of the remodels and upkeeps of some of the older buildings there. And just to give some more examples, that example I gave was of an empty lot. I want to give a couple more examples of what happens with other types of, like blighted buildings and actually like nice buildings, people are living in. Okay, and for this example, I'm going to use a section of Hartford called the Upper Albany District. Okay. It's a very nice area, or not nice area, blue-collar area. Has some nice houses, some houses that need some work. Here's a couple of pictures from that area. As you can see, there's a vacant lot on the left. That would have the same type of, if somebody with a land value tax, the same type of situation as we saw with the New London lot. But what we're interested in is the house on the right, which is actually a blighted house. This is owned by a bank in Virginia, I believe. And its current value is $68,000. That's for the house and the property, and the house is valued at like $57,000, and the property at $10,000. So if we created the graph like we did last time, this is pretty much what you look like on that blighted house. As you can see, you still get the same type of scale. The red scale is the traditional property tax, and right now the house is paying $1,469 on that property. Okay, if a land value tax was instituted, right away the tax on that land would go up to $1,614. However, what you can see is the investment. If somebody wanted to invest $100,000 in a house, which obviously looking at it, you can tell it needs some investment. Even though if you were just looking at whether taxes were going up and down, you would say, the taxes went up on this property. That's probably maybe not what we want. But if you look at the whole picture, as you can see, while the taxes went up just slightly on the blighted building, they came down tremendously if somebody invests them. So if they invest $100,000 in a house, They would pay, with a land value tax, $2,400 a year, and with a traditional property tax, to $3,630 a year. Okay, just one more example I'm going to give you. This is just a regular, this is a nice one family, owner lives there. This is also in Upper Albany. The housing value here is about $183,000 with about $19,000 on land value and about $163,000 on building value. Okay. So on this one, actually switching to a land value tax, people that live in those houses would actually get an initial tax break. They would get a tax break because the other houses were going up, the empty lots and the blighted houses. They would actually get an initial tax break. And just like the other houses, you can see not only do they get a tax break, any investment put on that housing coming forward, they will pay less taxes. They invest $50,000 in their house. With the land value tax, they'll pay $3,800. With the traditional tax, they'll pay $5,034 on it. And what basically the reason I did in a series like this, I just wanted to show another thing we say about a land value tax is it flips the script. The traditional property tax is the way it's set up. You're basically, people are punished for doing the right thing, investing in their houses. You invest in your house, your taxes go up, and you have to pay quite a bit more. On the other hand, if you let your house fall apart or bulldoze it, you're rewarded by paying less taxes. Going through those three examples, I think you can see how that actually flips the script. We are actually rewarded more for doing the right thing and discouraged from doing the wrong thing this way. And that's the last example. I just wanted to go through one more thing. That's like I said, that's like the granular level. I just wanted to give some examples, maybe going a little bigger, what else a land value tax works with, how be used to achieve certain goals. And the urban renewal, spurred by market forces, that would have been like the blighted house that I showed in the slides there. Discourages speculations, those are the empty lots. We looked at how it does that. Encourages infill development, that's the same as the empty lots. It wants to raise the taxes and lower on building. Okay, lowers taxes for the built environment. People who keep their houses nice, live there, keep them up in shape, are rewarded for doing so with not paying as high a tax bill. Okay, the last three, go a little deeper. Meet smart growth and environmental objectives. LVT does work a lot with smart growth, basically because it's a economic incentive to build densely. I mean, looking at those graphs I saw, you could say that you can see that basically a land value tax is an incentive to build as much building on as little amount of land as you can. And that's, when you're talking about doing that, you're talking about building dense. That leads to smart growth, which leads to mixed use, walkable, transit-oriented development, those other things that go with smart growth. And environmentally, basically, you can use a land value tax as an anti-sprawl tool. If you have an area where it's cheaper to build, you can draw some of that sprawl in from the outside areas where you don't want it to be into the area you want it to exist. Construction void of subsidies, that's basically, land value tax is kind of, it can be compared to abatements or enterprise zones or business improvement districts, things like that. It's just the land value tax is a typical tax. It works just like the property tax. You can have a land value tax and still use abatements. You can still use all those tools with the land value tax if you wanted to. But one of the advantages of the land value tax is that, like with abatements, they're temporary. They go off in a couple of years. You don't know if the person's going to stay there. They're usually targeted to like maybe a big business. It doesn't include like smaller businessmen who might want to get involved in abatement. Maybe it doesn't include them. And also, it takes less staff, take management. The land value tax, once it's instituted, is basically more of a free market reform. Abatements, things like that have to be managed. You need staff, you need forms. Things have to be looked at. And the last thing I'm going to hit on is job creation, which is kind of an interesting one. That's more of the economic one. That has to do with the ability that taxing land to an economist is different than taxing buildings, basically because buildings are produced, land isn't. So if you're taxing something that's not produced, you're not taking any jobs away from that. By taxing buildings, you're taxing carpenters, you're taxing unions, you're taxing home builders, and all the periphery business that go along with that. So that's where a land value tax helps with job creation. Okay. And with that, I'm going to send it back to Josh to finish up.
Interestingly, I think it was Mr. Hart that asked for effective tax rates. Bingo. We have the effective tax rates that we got from the OPM website. Effective tax rates, as we know, are probably the best way of determining what the actual tax incidence is on a particular community. And I'm glad that Representative Ritter came up with a map as well. It shows that great minds think alike, especially expectant fathers, I suppose. This is Connecticut. And what's most interesting is that when you look at effective tax rates and the disparity between the highest and the lowest is, as everyone knows, the city of Hartford. The effective tax rate is 34.84 mils. Now, in real life, if you're an accountant or a high school student, 34.84 mils is about 3.5%. So if you think about that, if you take a vacant lot in Upper Albany and you decide to build a house and you don't get the abatements and the subsidies, you're going to be paying 3.5% per year for the temerity that you've had to build a house inside of Hartford. And then if you take it out just 10 years, that's a 35% tax on the value of what you've done. That's almost as much as what we tax cigarettes or liquor. The one thing that Hartford wants, which are people and businesses and construction, is taxed to the extent that folks can't manage it. You know, there is a reason that downtown Hartford is just a series of flat-top parking lots. Why would you have a 20-story building, say 10, 15, 20 years ago, when it would make you no money to have a building there? Much easier to go out of town, much easier to leave. Buildings are as mobile as jobs or commerce or business. Buildings don't literally pick up and leave, but if you don't invest in labor and capital in a building, the building falls over. And if you tax it punitively, as we see here, you're going to discourage, by definition, you're going to discourage reinvestment and repopulation of the city. And you can't even see Greenwich, which has the lowest effective tax rate. And I like to think that my former board president, Ted Gortney, who was the assessor of Greenwich, is responsible for bringing in lots of value and so on, that you can barely see it on the map. You have to go all the way up the Connecticut Valley corridor to the old manufacturing cities and find spots where anybody that would invest, be they a homeowner or a business, would say, maybe not. Or if they did invest, they would ask for a large subsidy. Pfizer comes to mind to me, for example. So that is a problem. It's a problem of competition. It's a problem of a level playing field. And the larger cities in particular should have at least the permissive option to enact a land value tax wherein every building, past, present, and future, is subsidized and abated, but at no cost to the city. You know, it's not just Hartford. It's Waterbury, it's Bridgeport, it's Bristol, it's certainly New London or Norwich, and many, many other towns that are trying to rebuild their central business districts and bring middle-class families back in. So these are the achievable goals, and these are just hypothetical buildings. But the tax after an investment in the city of Hartford, again, we're using the 74 mil statutory rate, just simply, it does not pay for somebody to come in unless the state government gives a lot of aid and the state government does the heavy lifting. And it's our understanding, I'm from Philadelphia, I'm not from here, but Mark is, but it's our understanding that the days of heavy lifting done by the state are going to be over, at least for a little while. Cities have to be given the right to empower themselves to grow their own local economies. And we think that's what the land value tax can do. And so that we can go from that to this. And essentially that's our short and sweet version of what we've produced for you on our report, Bringing Transparency and Efficiency to the Property Tax System in Connecticut. There's been some interest over the past few years. The book has some of the past legislation. Some has gone very far. New London had a pilot program that you might be aware of that was never enacted. And Senator Looney has been trying assiduously to get permission for the larger cities of Connecticut to get permission to just try it, to get a local option. So with that, if there are any questions, I hope there will be. I thank you very much. And Mark thanks you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for your presentation, and thank you for taking the time, both of you, to present this to the committee. I think it's an interesting concept, and certainly well within our charge here to try to do something on the municipal level and create some options. And I know that this has been before this General Assembly, before the idea, as you've stated in your testimony. I'm going to refer over to Senator Fasano in a minute as the Senate Chair on Planning and Development, where I believe the bill in 2011 originated per your document.
Yes.
I just had one question, and I don't know if you had stated it before, if I missed it. How do you arrive at that separate LVT tax based on a mill rate? Is there an equation that you use to come up with that separate mill rate for land?
Yes, there is, Representative, and it's basically high school algebra.
Okay.
We try to gussy it up, but it's just algebra, and it's whatever you lose from the building part of the property tax, you make it up by splitting the difference, dividing it against the land value portion of the town.
Okay.
So it's pretty easy to come up with all kinds of iterations, and it's very easy for, as I said, Ebensburg, Pennsylvania has a staff of 3 people, and they do their tax rates on the back of an envelope every year. So it's doable.
And I'd like to add also that you can adjust the rates. I mean, that basically the standard rate, the slope of those lines on a land value tax, because you have the land and the value. You can adjust those to make it a severe land value tax, which would be the parallel line, or you can make it very soft, which would bring the slope of the line closer to the slope of the standard property tax.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Senator Fasano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know it's very much involved in the New London because they came to us, I think, 2 years or 4 years in a row. I can't recall. Mm-hmm. And some of my notes say that back in 1999 to 2003, this land value tax issue was bantered about this building. That's before my time. Yeah. And then we did approve it. We approved it for 2 towns, actually, a pilot program for 2 towns. One was New London, who really came up here and testified strongly for this, and I forgot the other town, but it was in that area as well. And then the second town bagged it and said, we don't want to do it the day we approved the bill. So we backed it off. We just did New London. Mm-hmm. And then New London took it, and they talked about it wherever in the town that they talked about, and they felt it was a bad idea. And they never went forward with it as a pilot program. I don't fully understand why they didn't, only because whether I agree with the policy or not, they certainly were very prepared and vigilant on having us pass it. Do you have any idea why New London did not go forward with it on a pilot program?
I have some thoughts about it. I mean, politics is local, as we know. I do most of my work in front of city councils all over the country. The city council and the mayor at the time were very supportive, and it was also a citizen-driven effort. And to me, that's pretty unique. My center doesn't run into citizens demanding a tax policy. And it was citizen-driven, and I think, therefore, it became somewhat personality-driven. Some property owners would have been hit hard the way it was proposed in New London. They were also given 4 options, and it's hard to choose 4 options on how to implement, in my experience, on how to implement a tax program. So I think there was a lot of confusion, and they felt they didn't have enough time to report to OPM. So in the end, they considered 5 options and finally decided they couldn't understand which one to implement. City government was really not on that commission that decided either. It was an appointed commission of non-elected officials. So I think that might have had something to do with it.
But we did give the New London the ability to, politically, if they wanted to, through their legislative branch, to adopt it. Their setting up committees was their, when it left us, they could have just enacted it. So if they did it through committees, I don't know what would be the reason for that, maybe to sort of get people to come into the system and think like them, I don't know, but they had the right to do it. But have you sat down and talked to any of the legislative leaders of New London and say, why didn't you implement this? This is what you asked for. What made you be discouraged in the idea?
There was concern from specific downtown owners of vacant land, and that was essentially it. The last official in New London I spoke with was Mayor Finizio, who was relatively new to the post and came in after the issue, and he's all for it, and he just wonders how to go back, hat in hand to Hartford and say, can we try it again?
I will also note that we did open this up to any other city or municipality who is interested in being part of the pilot. And nobody, and I know that we approached Hartford directly. I don't remember if we talked to Senator Looney, but he has a pulse on this building that we all know. So there were no takers from any of the cities, Bridgeport or whatever, and we had those representatives on our committee who wanted to further this. So would you then write exceptions to the land value tax? In other words, farmland would be exempt from this, I would think?
In Pennsylvania, for example, farmland is statutorily exempt from the land value tax.
Yeah, and same thing in Connecticut. That would continue on. You're not proposing, obviously, this to be on farmland, open space, land that is there?
No.
Recreational land would be exempt from this?
Well, that's already assessed so low, recreational and farmland, that I don't think they're taxable. Anything that's not on the grand list is a taxable subject, would not be subject under this. But we usually, almost always, work for cities to do this, that need that growth and that infill.
One of the things, as I'm speaking out loud, sort of, is the fact that Hartford didn't go forward with this because the parking lots were a necessity in the city of Hartford. And those of us who travel to New Haven know that parking lots are a necessity to city of New Haven because there's just not enough infrastructure, and the cost of building parking lots from a private developer point of view is a cost that's tough to recoup unless you have a shopping mall, which New Haven doesn't have, now the city of Hartford have. So what would be your impression upon a point of view that forcing our parking lots to become structures, and maybe not parking lot structures, but arguably retail structures, that would cause a problem with parking issues in New Haven or Hartford? What would be your counter-argument to that?
My counter-argument is pretty clear. If we're going to tax the surface parking lots and tax them out of existence, you have to come up with an incentive to put up a parking deck. And of course, if you go up 10 or 12 stories, you're essentially taking 12 lots and turning them into a money-making proposition. We're proposing untaxing the structure, not just taxing the land. It's that, as Mark was referring to, the carrot and the stick. And a parking lot, one thing that I think that we've missed in Connecticut is serious ongoing studies of tax incidents. How would it affect Hartford? Now, the parking decks in Hartford will save money with a land value tax. I mean, and thousands of dollars a year, significant amount of money. And so that would be the spur to build up instead of knocking buildings down and moving out.
And have you theoretically taken a parking lot and for Hartford and run an analysis for the cost of construction for a multi-level parking garage such that the return is worth the investment for the property owner? If you were to take his lot and do not a building but a parking lot structure, have you run those numbers?
We've run the numbers on existing properties. Mark is a builder, a former builder, I should say, and so he would do the floor area analysis. And in fact, we were in discussions with Representative Vargas and other members of the Hartford delegation to do just that, to study the outcome on future development.
Mark, have you looked at a parking lot, let's say right across the street over here from Hartford, and said, if we took that and made a parking garage, how many spaces, how tall will we have to recoup the cost of that construction?
That's a very good question, but no, I've actually never actually looked at a parking lot per se, but I don't think the calculation would be that hard. I mean, you can get square footage, how much it costs to build, and do the analysis that way by foot, you know, how much every story you go up, what's the cost per foot.
My fear would be unintended consequences for the big cities, because I'm talking now, remember, that was a big issue for Hartford, is that, listen, if we tax these lots out of existence such that their only choice is to put a building on it, then we've hurt more than we've helped on one other side of the issue, which is trying to get maybe vacant lots between buildings taxed at a different rate so someone builds something. The other question,
I agree.
Sorry.
I agree. That's both have to go hand in hand.
The other question I have is, with an empty lot, if I owned an empty lot between two buildings, under your land value tax, could I just pour a slab foundation, build a single-story, one flat roof, $200,000 or less with all the improvements done structure, and escape the land value tax, not do the highest and best use per se for what I could build on there, but for the purpose of avoiding the high land value tax, put a prefab building, plop it on a slab, and say, now go ahead, tax me on that one office, 800 square foot building, and I'm done. Can I avoid your issue by doing that?
I can actually grab that. That was an issue in Allentown, Pennsylvania, when this was brought in by a popular vote, I might add. So having citizens vote for a tax reform was kind of cool in our experience. The threat was, just as you said, people that didn't want a land value tax would say, well, people are going to put up skyscrapers in their backyards, you know, kind of overstating the case. But we pay a land tax right now. If you have a house, which you do, underneath it there's land value, and you're still being taxed on it. So you can't get away from a land tax. So if you did put a slab or a prefab carport or something like that, you wouldn't be charged on the carport that you put up or the prefab building that you put up, but you would still be paying a tax on the land value, just as you're doing now. It would be higher. In Pennsylvania, the experience with towns that are in trouble, say Altoona, you have a house, you have a vacant lot, and then you have a house because of years of urban decay. And so the city would split the lot, essentially eliminating any value, and give one half of the lot to one homeowner and give one half of a lot to another homeowner. And that's becoming sort of standard practice, providing flower bed lots, they call them in Pennsylvania. And in that way, you're not punishing the neighbor who's owning the vacant lot next door and is taking care of it. And that's a concern. I mean, it should be a concern in Hartford. I've seen it. So I would split the lot just like they do in Pennsylvania.
So the land's a constant, is what you're saying, is that you're going to be paid, no matter what happens to the structure, the high value on the land is the high value on the land. And so the way that you try to get that back is by having a structure that you have to put up right away to produce the income to help pay for all this, essentially.
Yeah, and most vacant
And what-
lots in our cities are owned by absentees. I mean, absentees in the sense of they don't live in the city. They don't care. You know, they're sitting on this land until the city finally gets fed up and, you know, takes it by eminent domain or provides sweeteners. So the value is a constant, depending on the market, of course. You know, if the market says there's no value in the land, your assessor will tell you that, and the land tax will go from $10 a year to $15 a year. I hope that answers it.
It does in part. The policy behind this, is it really just to say, look, a city has X number of dollars, has X amount of land, that never changes. The structures presumably change, those that are built up, those that fall in decay or are abandoned, but the land is the land is the land. So let's put the consequence of our income on the land, and the variable, the structure, we don't have to worry so much about. Is that essentially what this kind of does?
If I were going to thumbnail it, that would be my elevator speech. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Vecino.
Thank you. Good morning. So basically, as I listened to the testimony, this is geared more towards a city, highly dense areas where you can produce more from the land versus the structure. How does this promote future development when an outside developer looks at our state, at these certain areas compared to other states that are basically on the standard taxation rate? How is this going to look to the whole area as far as development goes?
I'll pass it over to Mark as a former developer from Arizona. But if you can go into a community and the tax rate on a structure is, by community I mean a city, a big dense city, as you just referenced. If that rate on the building is below that of the suburbs, or if it's below that of a Massachusetts town or a Rhode Island town, and we know it's below a Rhode Island town, or a New York town, you've provided that incentive that they can telescope for years down the road of making sure that it's going to be cheaper to put up a building in this city as opposed to anywhere else. And then you have to market the idea. Harrisburg enacted a land value.
Hire them to develop this land or potentially give them incentives. You know, why wouldn't they just pick up and just go to a different municipality if we created this tax on them?
Well, if you
What would be your counter argument to that? Because that may be
Yeah.
a concern that we would be just displacing and competing against municipalities again, like we often do.
Well, as Mark said, we have the stick, which is getting rid of that parking lot, and it's going to irk the corporate partner, who's a good corporate partner. But their building, which is already up and houses several hundred employees, has support businesses, you know, delivering hoagies or taquitos, whatever, grinders, whatever. I'm trying to get the right phrase up here. You know, all the ancillary support services and businesses, the maintenance. Yeah, they are going to enjoy a de-taxation of that extant building that will more than offset what they'll pay on the parking lot. In other words, nothing exists in a vacuum. It's a lever, and it goes both ways.
Okay.
I had a similar, to address your question there, I was talking to the councilman in Bristol last week. And of course, Bristol's the home of ESPN. And as soon as I started talking land value tax, that was the first, he goes, we have ESPN here, you know, we can't upset them. And in Connecticut, I mean, it's a little different laid out municipalities. It's in towns. Like in Pennsylvania, we have county government. Then inside the town is where you have the cities and towns, which is a dense area. Here, like a town could be a city center, which is dense, and then the suburbs, and then the rural area again, which is similar to what Bristol is. I don't think there's any reason you couldn't have a targeted LVT. It wouldn't have to cover the whole Bristol, what I told them. It would have to cover the whole Bristol. You find out the sections you want, the initial downtown, the main streets. He said he had some easy enterprise zones he was interested in looking at, and he kind of mapped me out some areas that he wanted me to look at for him, for an area. So I think in Connecticut, like there are some, like obviously New Haven can do city boundary to city boundary, Hartford, Bridgeport, probably. But most of them, I think you would have to have a targeted LVT because you would want to keep it inside an area where you want the development to occur. And obviously, some of these places are rural. I mean, you get out, there's actually farms, things like that.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I see some of your, some of the previous legislation in 2011 and 2009, and I see one part of the legislation left in distressed municipalities, and then the other, took it out and put some population numbers in. Obviously, that was done for a reason. But I would be interested to look at model legislation that was successful in Pennsylvania, and how it may compare to a couple of the documents that we have here, and incorporated within that. If you could make, and you gave testimony to the fact that in New London, I believe that the composition of this entity that was going to make the decisions, if you could create a little bit, give us a little bit model legislation here based on a little bit more of a committee that could have land use lawyers on it, political entities, aldermen or selectmen, and business community members, like an appointing authority, and then a number of members and a diversity of appointment of those members that you think fits, okay? And then we can kind of look at a document and making up some kind of bridge. If you can get that to us, that would be very beneficial for me and for the committee members, okay?
We'll certainly do that. OPM, if I recall, and I think I'm right, OPM directed a committee to be appointed by the city manager and council of New London. So I think it was a directive from OPM.
Yeah. I can see that in the section, yeah. But my concern is that it was too broad and it didn't target in on appointments that you would want to make that could be beneficial in the overall view in affecting in writing a document of policy. Because I think that's what they ran into problems with that.
There were no neighborhood groups, for example.
Yeah, I mean, there were the wrong people who were on the board. Yeah. I mean, so you got to give them direction as to, you have to have a land use lawyer. You have to have someone from the business community or chamber of commerce. You need to have
the broad
spectrum. Community person, neighborhood group, whatever. Okay.
Mm-hmm. We'll get
Joe Brennan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Joe Brennan from CBIA. First of all, thanks for putting together the book, because we've been dealing with this issue in Connecticut for many, many years, and we as an organization, we're always quite unsure whether or not we should support it or oppose it, because there were certain aspects we liked and others we were a little concerned about, but there just didn't seem to be a lot of information around it, so thanks for providing that. Just a couple questions quickly on Pennsylvania. I assume it's local option for municipalities in Pennsylvania,
yes,
whether to adopt this or not. I recall many years ago testimony at a hearing, and I thought somebody said that some towns, or at least one town, had repealed it once they enacted it. Is that true?
Yes, it is. In fact, more than one. It's a funny thing, local politics, as I said. And in some places, they expanded the land tax too quickly. I was referencing the Altoona story, where they took it slowly and gave business time to adapt and time to react. In Allentown, for example, one of the best friends of business now got into politics because of the land value tax, Pat Toomey, who's one of the senior members of the Banking and Finance Committee, now as a senator. The issue with CBIA members is it depends on what kind of building your members have. Some of them are going to hug you if there's a land value tax, because they'll be saving hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. in property tax. Some will not. So it really depends on what the city as a whole believes is best for the whole community, not just homeowners, not just business, and not just government. It has to be a partnership, and you have to take the time to decide if it makes sense for your community. In Allentown, we had the Chamber of Commerce supporting it. In Philadelphia, the realtors and the Chamber of Commerce wants it. And in Pittsburgh, when they repealed it, BOMA, sort of an analog organization to yours, freaked out because every one of their members saw their tax liability go up 30, 40, even 50% a year because they were skyscrapers and they were tall buildings. So it really depends on each individual parcel, and then the city makes that reasoned call about whether to adopt it or not. But the ones that have rescinded it mostly went too fast, or there were too many vacant lot owners downtown that were heavily affected. And we recommended against these cities expanding it. You know, we work with all of these towns, and they said, no, we want to give our homeowners a tax cut. And they didn't think about the other side of it, which is commerce. You've got to have a healthy central business district. You've got to have a healthy service economy of gas stations and donut shops. And so that's why you have to take it in a gradual, rational, and thoughtful way to know exactly what's going to happen down the road, which you can do in the state.
Right. Yeah, because that's the other point I wanted to make is that, we talk about because of tax reasons, it'd be better to put up a 12-story tower instead of a parking lot. But there's so many market forces that will determine whether that makes sense or not. Mm-hmm. You can't just say, okay, I'm going to put up a 12-story tower if you don't know if you're going to be able to lease it or that it's going to, make any sense. So there's a lot of factors that go into it, as well as obviously cities have a lot of other factors too, as far as transportation infrastructure, crime rates. There's an awful lot that goes into this other than just the tax. And just one other quiet question too is we've only talked about Connecticut and Pennsylvania. Is there experience from other states using this mechanism to try to create economic development in urban centers?
Good question. Very mild, and it's mostly in agricultural areas, ironically enough, in farm areas, but real farm areas that aren't under pressure from city sprawl. South Dakota, if you're agricultural, your buildings are exempt. You're only taxed on the land value and your land improvements. Kauai and Maui County both have the land value tax, but they also have classification, which is bad, as we both agree. Business is taxed at a higher rate than residential. I would love to go to Kauai and Maui County and do research, but so far my board will not fund that trip. But it's used mostly in Australia, New Zealand, Denmark, various cities in Africa. Hong Kong and Singapore use the model. The government owns the land, but they collect rent off of it so that they don't have to charge traditional property tax or income tax or corporate tax. So it's more of a presence overseas than it is right now in this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Representative Vargas.
Those are the hazards of not having read the agenda ahead of time. But this was precisely the group that I was asking our chairman, Representative Berger, to invite at a future meeting. But we have one less thing on our plate by you guys having come. I want to thank Josh and Mark for the presentation. Representative Ritter and myself have been trying to work with Councilman Deutsch in exposing this issue to our city government, and we're excited about the prospect. And I think it makes sense when you were talking about some of the smaller towns that have city centers but also have rural areas, about maybe creating a zone that uses the LVT. That would be an incentive if someone wanted to build a dense structure to do it within that zone, and might help prevent sprawl into our dairy farms and our communities, and concentrate those services in those town centers. So I like the idea. I thank you for your presentation. I hope this committee will seriously consider what you presented to us today. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative. And we will give you the benefit of the doubt that maybe you thought there was a different model out there for this concept that you were going to present. Matt.
Matt Hart, Town of Mansfield. Thank you for your informative presentation today. And Representative Vargas just hit at the question I wanted to ask, which is, how can you apply the LVT to promote smart growth in more rural areas? Many of the rural towns in Connecticut, we've zoned our single-family residential neighborhoods at 2 acres plus for decades. You know, and that has been done to promote a certain aesthetic, rural character, etc. Now we're realizing maybe that wasn't such a great idea because we have these increased infrastructure costs, and housing is no longer affordable, particularly workforce housing. So can this tax be utilized to promote cluster-style development and at the same time to preserve farmland and open space? And if so, how would that work?
Well, there are several precedents, actually, and in fact, I would add, I forgot one land value tax, and that's Kansas City, Missouri has an overlay for their park system, and it's a tax based upon the land value based in proximity to parkland. So if you have an amenity, you put in a special overlay, and the land value capture comes into you. TOD is a very similar concept. If you want to have development right around your transportation nodule, then you remove or switch out all other forms of tax except for a tax on the land value to spur and reward development. I'm going to pass it over to Mark simply because we spoke with somebody from Simsbury, and they're facing that issue right now of having the formerly traditional sprawl growth, and now they have a central business district where they want to create out of whole cloth a central business district. And I think maybe you can add to that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, what you're talking about is we gave a presentation in the fall to SNEPA, the Planning Association, and that was a lot of what we talked about is how do you keep the sprawl, the outside the cities intact, and how do you draw the building, the development into where you want it to go. And that was one of the features of an land value tax is it makes it cheaper to build in that area if you're building denser. It's like I said, it's basically, in a nutshell, it's an economic incentive to build as much building on as little amount of land as you can. So that's obviously, we're talking building up and building dense. So if you had a section like that where you wanted to pull development in, that's the type of development you would be looking for. Condos, taller condos, apartment buildings, something that would go up.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, a central business district or a bid or an overlay. In fact, the New London Central Business District was one of the organizations that still would like to have a land value tax in the Bank Street, State Street area of New London. And you can apply any tax regime in a special district. But because you're investing and because you want development, the value that the town, create the land value. You want to recapture that and leave it to the market to profit off of their own efforts. So that's the motivation behind that. It's very possible. We've played around with a few districts already. Mark did Upper Albany as if it were its own taxing entity, for example. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. If there are, Representative C. Wright's going to have a question. If there aren't any other pressing questions, I'd like to maybe wrap this up following some concluding questions from Representative Wright, if that's okay with the committee members. And we'll take, after Representative is done, we'll take a short 5-minute break, and we have the Connecticut assessors here to battle out with the Connecticut tax collectors. Representative C. Wright.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You were just touching a little bit on what I was thinking about. And I'm a complete believer in building dense and building up. But I'm thinking there are certain times when you would want an open space in like an inner city. I mean, it might be like a playground area, or it might be a community garden type of area, which may be owned by the city or it may be owned privately. How how would that fit into the land value proposal?
It actually fits in a more beneficial way to a land value tax. If you have a playground or if you have a green space that's designated, think about Savannah, Georgia, and they have a town square park every few blocks. That makes the land values very high. So it's to the benefit, Representative Wright, of if you apply a public asset, a public amenity around all that dense construction, or around that area that's zoned for dense construction, you're actually going to get it sooner, and you're actually increasing land values in the area that is taxable. If it's not a taxable lot and it's a public amenity, we urge the usual transfer of development rights, some legal mechanism to make sure that it stays undeveloped.
Easements, something like that.
Easements, yeah, exactly. We have a lot in the toolbox already in Connecticut and elsewhere to do that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative.
Thank you, Representative. So we will take a short 5-minute break and then reconvene at 1:15 for our final segment. Thank you.